A long time ago, around about the time a nice man was sitting on the Sea of Galilee and wondering why we couldn't all be a bit nicer to one another, 3,000 miles away, a woman is sitting on another shore, looking across the green strip of grass and sedge that clings to the coastline between the water and the dark lines of heather moor and rock inland. A dog sits by her, and they are keeping an eye on the stubborn sheep that wander off when nobody is looking. The dog stirs, looks back at the woman and scratches itself. She hopes it doesn't have fleas. Although the last couple of weeks have been dry and mild, the nights are cold, and the dog is warm to sleep next to at night. The light breeze suddenly picks up, and the dog's ears prick at the smell of smoke it brings with it. Before she has time to consider the strange tang on top of the normal peaty smell of hearth smoke, a cry jolts out of the air. Fire! This is a fiction, based on true events, and it's a way of thinking about the landscape and economy of the Scottish Iron Age. Between 50 BC and 60 AD, there was a catastrophic fire here at Clogtal Broch in Assynt. The building was the round stone structure that you can see in the foreground, and when it burnt down, the roof and walls fell in on top of the contents that included heather bedding and flooring, straw, grain stores, tools and equipment. To understand what the impact of this fire might have been, we need to address some unanswered questions about the Iron Age in this part of the world. We don't know enough about how many people might have been around, how the land was used and managed, whether this might have been a nasty setback or a complete death blow to a community who lived here. It's also important to understand, as it's possible that this period may have had a formative effect on the landscape inherited by the people who came after, with its echoes in what we see today. It's therefore a reminder that there can be an exceptionally long legacy of any period of custodianship, and we should be mindful of the legacy that we might leave behind to our future generations. I'm using evidence taken from lake cores recovered directly adjacent or near to archaeological sites to answer some of these research questions. The first question one might ask about the fire at Clogtal is, what happened to the people? Was there anywhere to go? There are numerous undated prehistoric sites along the coast, but establishing how old they are and how long they lasted is difficult. It's not pragmatic or even ethical to excavate them all, so any non-intrusive way of establishing a timeline for them is a good thing. And in the case of sites on or right next to the water, the idea is that we could establish the timing of settlement from the impact on lake sediments. So your proxy record in your lake core does something like this. You measure the start and the end date of that peak using radiocarbon or another suitable technique, and you have a duration. The theory is that the intensity of the proxy signal from the sites directly on the water will be stronger than those generated from the environment. For sites not on water but where there's known settlement, you could perhaps use the lake cores to infer the presence of human activity in the landscape and date this more accurately. The likely impact will be less pronounced and more complicated as the signal will be the result of more than one thing, human and environmental impact. Assuming that we can separate out the human impact from, say, climate change and get an accurate enough chronology, can we then start to say something about sites across a landscape? Were there a lot at the same time or a few? Might they have been doing different things, different locations, and so on? So I'm trying to establish these as a series of principles based on 2 archaeological sites and 3 lochs close to them. Firstly, the broch, and secondly, a crannog about an hour's walk away here at Loch na Clash. A crannog is an artificial or augmented island, usually with a structure on it, possibly a dwelling. The one at Loch na Clash is small, so probably only one building, if that. The Loch na Clash crannog was actually the first site where I could get a sediment core, and the data from here is the focus of this talk, but it does have a direct bearing on the story of the broch, as we'll see later. So, multiproxy analysis is rather like building a case from a series of pieces of circumstantial evidence, with each bit hopefully corroborating, or if you're unlucky, contradicting the next piece of evidence. But broadly, what X-ray fluorescence, carbon and nitrogen ratios, and isotopic composition of carbon and nitrogen do is try to determine the origin of the sediment and therefore the conditions that created it. So in lake processes might generate organic sediment as algae and other microorganisms grow and die, and changes to the loch alter the rate of this growth, so temperature, pH and so on. The introduction of terrestrial material, either directly as in-washed or through indirect erosion, may be directly detectable, but also indirectly detectable as they can increase the aquatic productivity if the in-wash contains nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Proxy measures of lake ecosystems and their interpretation are quite difficult, as you have to struggle with things like equifinality. So a certain reading can have resulted from more than one set of conditions. So quite a lot of what I'm doing involves process of elimination. However, the preliminary results look promising. When we opened the core, it was clear that we probably captured sediment relating to the crannog and a layer that contained in-wash material, heather fragments and a grain of charred barley that can only have come from human activity. When we sent this for radiocarbon dating, it came back as Iron Age, and importantly for our fictional account, contemporary with carbon dates at Clatol Broch. The date is indicated by the uppermost red arrow. Another date from lower down in the core came back as Neolithic, so the bounding box gives us a contextualisation for the later prehistoric period sediments. The left-hand side is X-ray fluorescence data, and Si and Ti, silicon and titanium, are more conservative lithogenic elements and can indicate erosion of minerogenic material. So I'm suggesting that what we might be seeing is a gradual increase in erosion through the prehistoric period, but at fairly low levels. This falls in with what we know from other studies in northwest Scotland that suggested either a gradual or periodic deforestation in the landscape from the Neolithic onwards. However, there is a caveat. Some or all of that silica could be biogenic in origin, i.e. related to lake productivity, and this needs to be tested by further analysis. In the middle of the diagram, we have zinc and an iron-manganese ratio. Again, the interpretation of these can be complex. Zinc will form complexes with organic compounds when it's coincident with increasing levels of carbon, and it can indicate erosion from a catchment when industrial pollution can be ruled out. We can see a slight increase in percentage of organic carbon, which suggests but doesn't prove that this is what's happening. The iron-manganese ratio tells us about the oxidation state of the waters. A significant switch in the relative abundance of elements occurs at 93 to 94 centimetres, so right when our crannog sediments are. Above this depth, there's a real marked increase in FeNN and no indication of increasing clastic material, so Si and Ti, or erosional indicators. The working hypothesis is that the iron-manganese indicates an abrupt change in lake water conditions to increased reducing conditions as a result of increased organic decay. The corresponding short spike in delta 15 nitrogen and the carbon-nitrogen ratio suggests increased nutrient supply, perhaps still from erosion, although the coincidence with the crannog layers strongly suggests direct human impact from material from the crannog washing into the loch, quite possibly containing effluent, and this causes a significant jump in productivity and organic decay. Pollen can tell us about what types of vegetation are present in the landscape. On the right-hand end of the diagram are tree species, followed by shrubs and heath vegetation. Particularly prominent is heather, the calluna, and then come sedgeous grasses and herbs. The pollen shows that there's a decline in trees, relative increase in heather and slight increase in grasses and sedge through the prehistoric period. The first cereal pollens also appear, and there's a number of species that like disturbed or grazed ground, such as docks, sheep sorrels and devil's bit scabious. Although some of these appear and disappear, the general pattern looks as though there's more consistent disturbance in the Iron Age, and the cereal pollens appear more frequently. I think that what this is showing is that, along with the signs of clearance and slight increase in erosion that we saw in the previous diagram, um, there's more use of the landscape for agriculture and grazing, but this might vary in its intensity over time. I also think that it's likely that soils are becoming more impoverished or less available as time goes on. The large increase in Kaluna and also spores, which aren't actually shown on this diagram, could mean that there's an expansion of heath and moorland, as these are more acid tolerant taxa, and as soils in this geology tend to get more acid the more waterlogged they become. To date, then, I have a picture of what one part of the Assynt Peninsula looked like through time, and the next step will be to do this over again for the other two lochs near the brochs to see if this pattern repeats or if there are differences in the nature of landscape change through time and space. From my sediment core at Loch na Clash, I already have a good idea that the site was contemporary with the broch, so to end where we began, I'd like to think that my imaginary woman from the story maybe lived at this crannog, and on hearing that cry of fire, ran down to see what she could do to help. And my fictional account is really a story of a community that comes together in a time of crisis. Thank you for listening.